I'm really happy to be here for Tech Tuesday at Noblis. This seems like an awesome program run by this company, so I'm excited. So if you take a look, I titled the presentation Bitcoin Solving the Unsolvable, and I'll go into exactly why that is a little later in the presentation. But I wanted to note, a little note at the bottom is sincere. I did adapt this from work. A young man put up an excellent, well-researched presentation. I adapted his work about 2 years ago, and when he did it, he put in a Bitcoin address, which I have left there at the bottom for tips. So this might seem sort of innocuous at first, but in reality, it actually meant quite a bit. This is a record of his address. So you can see he received about 1.25 Bitcoin. And all he did was put up a presentation online that some people looked at. So that's about $900 right now. And this is just some kid just put it up. And that's something that really hasn't been possible before. I mean, you could put up a PayPal email address, but you couldn't just make it very easy for people who are interested in what you were talking about to do it. So I wanted to start off with an introduction to Bitcoin's utility. Tipjars. I mean, it's so basic, but it is very impactful, and it can do a lot more meaningful things than that as well. People can make it very easy to fundraise for very significant activities. Charities like creating water sources for people in Africa, even like local fundraising for medical bills for someone in need. Those things have all been made easier by cryptocurrency because it's now easy for someone to just act like their own bank. They can create a bank account for themselves and just publicize the information, and then whoever wants to on the internet can donate. It's made the process much simpler, and as a result, it's much more common and much more efficacious as well. So who here is already familiar with Bitcoin? So is there anyone in the room who has read about it? Understands it? Some hands went down. OK. Owns some? Any owners? Couple? Trades? Mines? Is Satoshi Nakamoto? No? All right. So Bitcoin was proposed in a 2008 white paper by a pseudonymous entity called Satoshi Nakamoto. Most people believe this is a facade for a group of people. They've examined the code and so on, and it doesn't look like it's the work of one person. So he released it in 2009, or they released it in 2009 as open source software. Since then, it's been taken over by a group of people, the Bitcoin Core development team. It's updated regularly, and it's currently on version 0.9.0. So in some ways, it's actually sort of still in beta, which is funny for something that's had such an impressive impact on the world. So what actually is it? It's an open source peer-to-peer cryptographic currency. I know that that is the explanation that you always hear in the first sentence of news articles, and it doesn't really mean anything at first. So I'm just going to go through and sum up some of the common misconceptions. First, it is not anonymous. Anyone who says that is simply wrong. It is pseudonymous. There is a difference. Transactions within Bitcoin are not entirely irreversible, but they are, for practical purposes, mostly irreversible. The stock ticker is sometimes XBT instead of BTC. You'll see it listed as both occasionally. So, and one more common misconception, there are two different things that we talk about when we say Bitcoin. If it's with a capital B, we're referring to the protocol like HTTP, the system that allows you to access the internet, or SMTP, email. If it's with a lowercase or is the BTC abbreviation, people are generally talking about the currency. It's used as a store of value, a unit of exchange, and so on. So anonymity and pseudonymity. In an anonymous system, you can't prove your identity. You're a string of numbers, and you can be a different string of numbers tomorrow, and you can't prove that you are a certain string of numbers last week. So there's really no persistence of identity. If you could prove your identity, you weren't actually anonymous in the first place. So anonymous systems are obviously vulnerable to impersonation, and they don't have that persistent identity. In a pseudonymous system, like Bitcoin, you can prove your identity. Someone whose identity is Ben week 1, if someone shows up and their identity is Ben week 2, they're still the same person, or at least the same account. I mean, obviously you're on a computer. You could be a dog or something. So identities can't be impersonated, and they can be persistent. You're not anonymous, but you could be multi-pseudonymous. I could be Ben 1, Ben 2, Ben 3, Ben 4, Ben 5. You can make many identities. And so with the option to make infinite identities, you can be basically anonymous. For all practical purposes, if you have infinity identities and they're just random strings of characters, you can be anonymous if you choose to, but you are not truly anonymous because you could return to a previous identity. And the importance of that is that within the Bitcoin protocol, you can use that pseudonymous feature to decide whether you want an individual action to be anonymous or to be linked to yourself. So I have a particular wallet address, and I could sign a message with that address that I use for donations to my website, the blockchain. So if I sign something from that, people know it's coming from me. But if I am making a transaction online and I'm buying something that I don't particularly want everyone to know I'm buying for some reason, I can use a different identity. So at the same time, I can be both things within one system. I can be an anonymous entity purchasing something online, and I can be a public entity making a statement using his own address. So the centerpiece of the Bitcoin technology is the blockchain. It is a decentralized ledger of account balances. So decentralized is a word you'll see a lot within the Bitcoin protocol. A decentralized ledger simply means it's stored on many computers throughout the world, and input is taken into it from many computers throughout the world. You can think of it as essentially being a Dropbox of information, except that instead of Dropbox as centralized servers at wherever their headquarters are, it is simply stored on computers and transmitted throughout the world. Transactions in the network are simply entries. They just say X transfers Y to Z. Very simple accounting, nothing weird going on there. Transactions are voted on by the network. I'll go into voted on in a second. So with a simple majority, though, they become added to the ledger permanently. They can't really be removed. So addresses, the sort of basis for the whole system, are a public-private key pair. A key pair, each part of it is a 25-digit randomized, well, semi-randomized. You can actually create vanity addresses, which people use occasionally. Semi-randomized list of numbers and letters, capital, non-capital, and so on. They have no other identifying info. You don't have to sign up for an account. You don't have to do anything. You just need to generate these cryptographic functions. So that's very important. Because there's no account, there's no central authority. Account creation, quote unquote, is governed simply by mathematical rules that create addresses and nothing else. So it means that anyone who wants to build a way to create a public and private key pair can. There are many, many, many systems that will allow you to do that if you like. So transactions are referred to in the blockchain by the public key, also known as the public address. That's simply where you're sending your things. You can think about it as directly analogous to the email on your PayPal account. When someone wants to send you money, they type in your email. When you want to send someone Bitcoin, you type in their address. So transactions from an address must be signed by the private key. And that doesn't reveal the private key because of the cryptography behind it. It's sort of the equivalent of the CVV on the back of your debit card, except that when you flip over your public key, the CVV isn't there. So it can't be stolen as easily as it can with a debit card, which is, of course, the problem with them. Values are tracked by looking into the past of the blockchain. If you read from the beginning, block 0, the beginning of the world, to the front, and go forward in time, you can simply read through the whole thing, and you'll know how much money everyone controls within the system. There is a problem with this, which is that over time, it gets very clogged. At the moment, it's 18 gigabytes of data, which means that downloading it takes a little while. 18 gigabytes of data is somewhere around 20 high-definition, full-length movies. Not exactly what you want to be downloading. But there are methods to mitigate this. Commonly, if you have an app that lets you work with Bitcoin, it will connect to a cloud server that stores the blockchain and just query it for information. So you're not really downloading it most of the time. You can, if you want to become a node for the network to help other people verify transactions and so on. But it's not really necessary. Very few people really need to download the blockchain. Although the more people that do, the more decentralized it is, the harder it is to attack, the better distributed it is. So how are transactions made? This is going to sound a lot like some other protocols you've heard of, HTTP, SMTP, and so on. Step 1, you make a packet that's a transaction. Step 2, you establish a connection to the network. Step 3, you broadcast it. Step 4, they broadcast it. Step 5, the people who process the transactions, miners, whose jobs we will explain in a moment, may incorporate your transaction into the next block they try to produce. Why may? May in order to avoid malicious attacks. So what kind of malicious? Well, the obvious one is they could try and spend money that was spent already. This is called a double spending attack. This can occur in theory within the Bitcoin network, but it requires some very, very impressive work on the parts of the criminals. And in fact, it requires so much work on their part that it's actually just not worth it to them. In order to do that, they'd have to own 51% of the network, which is estimated at costing, if you were just trying to buy all of that, would cost about half of the value of the Bitcoin network at this point, so about $3 to $4 billion, depending on whose estimates you read. And if you then use that to double spend, you'd be destroying the value that you had just purchased, essentially. it would be sort of nonsense in a way. You'd be spending $4 billion to destroy your own $4 billion plus a lot of other people's, and at the end of it, you wouldn't even have made any money because no one would want to use the network anymore. All you would be doing is sort of burning something to the ground for the sake of burning it to the ground, and spending your own money to do so. So the reason that this is that digital value currencies, the original problem that Bitcoin solved, and why I've titled this Solving the Unsolvable, is that if you want to use a piece of data to transmit value, then the data can't be copied and retain its value. If that was possible, the whole thing would be worthless, of course. So some systems to accomplish this use a centralized authority. PayPal does that. They have an internal ledger that's just like the blockchain. The only difference is that if there's something wrong with it, the only people who know are PayPal and the customer. Within Bitcoin, if there's something wrong, everyone knows. It's public. So Bitcoin uses a decentralized authority, the network. And that network simply governs it by saying that the first attempt to spend any unit of value is the attempt that wins. So first, we need to check whether or not an individual transaction is valid. So Alice, A, if you prefer, says she paid you a Bitcoin. How do you know she's not scamming you? How do you know she really had the Bitcoin to spend? Well, when the next block's found, the transaction will propagate to the blockchain. You can then look it up just on the internet. There are probably 50 or so websites that host the blockchain and just let people look through it. The most popular one is a website called blockchain.info that also provides a lot of other useful Bitcoin services. If you're interested in looking into Bitcoin a little more or researching individual pieces of it, I strongly recommend their website. It's an excellent free service. So sometimes you'll, in addition to waiting for the first block that pops up in the blockchain, you'll want to wait a little longer than that to demonstrate the transaction was not an erroneous fork. An erroneous fork would be if two different nodes created two different blockchains at the same time. One of them has to be accepted by the network as the proper one. The other one has to go away and no one is going to use it. So in order to demonstrate that Alice's one Bitcoin payment to you wasn't an erroneous fork, you'll sometimes wait for the network to just keep going, just to make sure that nothing was wrong. This isn't entirely necessary, but sometimes it is a good idea. In particular, it's a good idea for high security platforms, like Bitcoin exchanges, like Mt. Gox, the failed one, or Bitstamp, Bitfinex, and plenty of others. Most of those exchanges use a 6 confirmation system, which means they're waiting about an hour before they will accept your deposit to their system as valid. So this is an over-secure way of doing it. 6 confirmations is excessive, but it's excessive on purpose because those institutions do not want the chance of a significant loss of customer funds due to issues with this. So what does first mean within Bitcoin? Bitcoin includes a robust and decentralized timestamp server. It relies on a chain of timestamps, each incorporating a digest of the previous hash, proving it came after a certain event, the previous stamp. So I'm sorry that that does not make sense the way it is written, but it is sort of a little hard to explain without an analogy. So if you have a block and a time, and you jam them together and you hash it using SHA-256, the encryption method Bitcoin runs on, you end up with some gibberish. It'll look kind of like an address. It's just a long string of characters. So what the Bitcoin network does is it takes that gibberish and the next block, block 2, and the next time, and it merges it together, and it makes a hash, and that is gibberish version 2. And so you know that the block 2 one came after block 1 because it included the gibberish created from the first one, and so on and so forth. For block 3, you simply use gibberish version 2, and you're going to end up with gibberish version 3. I apologize for calling it gibberish repeatedly, but it's sort of a fun word. So what is mining? Mining is what actually allows the Bitcoin network to function. It's what allows it to process transactions, to exchange value between people. So the act of taking transactions that are proposed. So I send a Bitcoin to my good friend Mike because he's such a good friend, and it goes into a block, and I propagate it to the, or sorry, it doesn't go into a block, sorry, I propagate it to the network to try and get it into a block, and a miner is the one who puts it into a block. And they then finesse the block to try to get it accepted by the Bitcoin network. The finessing part is what is referred to when people are talking about mining. So miners do not have to accept all transactions. And in fact, they should reject transactions under certain circumstances. They should reject transactions that, if I try and send them a Bitcoin, but I only had 0.1 Bitcoin in my account, clearly that shouldn't happen. No one should let that happen. I can't have negative funds. This isn't a bank. So miners may reject transactions that don't include a transaction fee as well. So when you send a transaction, it's customary to sort of send a tip to miners. And as that goes through, your transaction is likely to process quickly. So why should they reject bogus transactions? Well, first, if they produce a block, like if they get lucky and finesse a block and produce a block incorporating bogus transactions, no one else in the network is going to accept it. So all their work is going to have gone to waste. They're going to get nothing as their reward because no one else will want it. They'll say, well, why are you including this transaction where Ben is clearly doing something illegitimate within the network? Why are you letting that happen in your block? I don't want this. So every miner competes to get their block accepted. No one wants a block rejected. And when they do get a block accepted, they're rewarded for it. So how's the winning block chosen? Crypto randomly. So within each block, there are a few fiddle fields. You could think of them as just blank spaces. In them, you can fill anything you want in. And it's important that you can fill anything you want in because that's how the system works. So what you are doing as a miner is you're taking the block that has the information with all the transactions, and you're taking the nonce, which is whatever number or set of letters or anything else you want, and you're working with SHA-256, which is the cryptography Bitcoin runs on, and you are creating a hash of it, a double hash, in fact. And at the end of that, you'll end up with a 256-bit numerical value. If it is below the currently required target by the network, then you have succeeded in creating a block. So the importance of this is simply that there is no way to cheat at building a block. The only way to do it is sort of by brute forcing it. You put work into the cryptography of it, and you can create a block only through the random chance, essentially, of finding something below the target. There is really no other way to do it, and that's how the system works. Without that, it simply wouldn't work. You know, if people could decide when they wanted to create a block, then sort of the whole thing falls apart very quickly. Luckily, SHA-256 is pretty hard to compromise. So if what you get is not below the target number, then you can simply try again as many times as you want. SHA-256 is computationally intensive, which just means that if you tried to do it by hand, you'd probably go insane before finishing. But a computer can do it pretty quickly, although not incredibly quickly. The target changes over time based on how the network is functioning. If the network is moving faster than scheduled, then the target will get harder, and it will be harder to find blocks, and the network will move slower. If the network is moving too slow, the target will get easier. The process of finding blocks will get simpler, and the network will return to its goal of one block every 10 minutes. If you have one block every 10 minutes, you'll find 2016 blocks in 2 weeks, which is why that's the original number. This system is in place so that as the network grows, the basics of it don't change. The basic function of Bitcoin is that every 10 minutes there's a block. If you allowed that number to speed up as the network grew, then you would run into all sorts of problems very, very quickly. This is the system designed to solve that problem. So SHA-256 is really complex, very powerful encryption. It's used by the CIA and spy agencies and so on, and it's basically impossible to crack. A particular entry always results in the same thing. So if I put in frog, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, fox, A, B, C, D. It's important to note that the F in frog and the F in fox have nothing to do with the answer. SHA-256 only looks at the whole thing you put into it. So just knowing that there's an F at the front doesn't tell you anything about the answer at all, which is why you could end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, and A, B, C, D. These are examples, obviously. In reality, you'd end up with something totally different. So the other important thing is that 1, 2, 3, 4 does not tell you frog backwards. You can't reverse engineer it. Otherwise, obviously, the whole thing would be very easy to crack. As a little fun fact, due to the energy content of information, 2 to the 256 pieces of information, which is the amount of information in a 256 binary string, is infeasible to be cracked without quantum computing. Don't ask. So this is the target difficulty. As you can see, as the network grows over time, the target difficulty increases over time. It's pretty basic. This is essentially linked to the development of Bitcoin as a protocol, as a network, as a currency, and so on. As it develops, more people add miners to the network. As more people add miners to the network, the target difficulty goes up, and the whole process keeps going. And it's pretty much infinitely scalable. No matter how much hashing power gets put into the network, it can always keep going up like this and fix itself. Transaction fees mentioned earlier go with mining. Whenever you create a transaction, you can send a fee with it. If you don't send a fee, you may run into some issues. So if, for example, I accidentally, when sending that Bitcoin to Mike, and we'll pretend I really had the Bitcoin to send him this time, I sent him 1 Bitcoin from my 1 Bitcoin account, and so I didn't pay a transaction fee. I sent a 0 Bitcoin transaction fee. It might take me a really long time for that transaction to go through. In some cases, I believe the longest anyone's ever seen was about 3 weeks before it got picked up. But more commonly, it will be about 2 to 3 days, which is still much longer than any of us would want. To solve this, you can pay a simple fee. At the moment, the standard fee, and I don't mean standard as in everyone must use this. I mean standard as in this is the default for most systems within Bitcoin, is about 0.0001 Bitcoin, or 6 cents at the exchange rate when I made this presentation. It's actually about 7 cents now, so we're doing pretty well. So the point of these transaction fees is to cover the costs of those miners operating the network. So the computationally intensive work of SHA-256 costs energy. It costs literally energy, electricity. You have to be running this little machine that is solving these math problems for you, and somehow we as users of the network have to subsidize this. We have to pay them for their work in creating that ledger. Just like you're paying PayPal for their work when you're paying a fee to PayPal, we are paying a fee to the Bitcoin miners when we're using their system. It just happens that our fee is much, much, much less than the one PayPal charges. So the fees themselves are free for the miners to set, essentially. If all miners suddenly agreed that none of them would accept transactions that paid less than 0.1 Bitcoin in fee, or $60 to $70, then suddenly that would be the minimum. No one's going to do that because people would compete with them. If someone wanted to say, oh, let's make it 0.1 Bitcoin, someone would say, okay, well, I'll make it 0.09 Bitcoin, because that's still a huge amount of money for doing basically nothing, especially considering it's only about 6 cents now. So the fees themselves can change over time based essentially on a free market of miners. Those people who have the computers hashing it will adapt the network and its fee system to whatever people are willing to pay. As you can see, this can result in something very good for customers if there is a sort of bubble of Bitcoin miners, as there has been. When Bitcoin achieved pretty major recognition, popping over $1,200 briefly, a ton of people thought, oh, that sounds like a great thing to get involved in. Let's go buy a Bitcoin miner. It turned out that that's the same idea thousands and thousands of other people had, which in turn made it not a great idea. As a result, transaction fees are actually going lower over time. Because so many people bought Bitcoin miners and are trying to recoup their expenses, there's a lot of extra competition that wasn't there before. So when other people make mistakes by buying miners when they perhaps shouldn't have been buying them, this is what happens. Fees go down. So the mining reward. So I've been talking about transaction fees is what miners are paid. They're also paid another source of income. When you find a block through that crypto random process, when you get lucky and find it, you're paid an amount of Bitcoin. At the moment, it's about 25 Bitcoin. It was set to 50 to start. This is simply a part of the protocol. Anytime you find a block, you can issue yourself a reward for finding it. Very simple. So over time, the reward drops. It's on a half-life system about every 4 years, and that's approximate, just like the 2 weeks for finding 2016 blocks is approximate. The mining reward drops by half. The last Bitcoin is estimated to be issued in 2140, but in 2040, so 100 years before that, the 20 millionth one will be issued, at which point about 95% of the currency will be out there. At this point in time, it's about 13 million that have been issued, so about 60% of the currency. So you can sort of see that quickly it scales down. It's only been 4 years and we're at 60%, but it's going to be another 30 years before we get the next 35%. And it's 100 years from there before the whole thing is completed. So this mining reward has multiple purposes. Of course, it's to introduce the currency units slowly. If you suddenly pop them all into existence, then whoever the first people on the scene were would get everything. In this way, we're incentivizing people to invest in the equipment and so on, and we're incentivizing early adopters in particular. Because it scales down over time, the people who get in first receive more of the benefits, but not an infinite amount more. So in the early days, with very few competitors, mining Bitcoin could receive you a lot of Bitcoin. In fact, one particular person, Satoshi Nakamoto, has quite a few Bitcoin, about 1 million, in fact. So all of his coins, which we have sort of tracked down, there are some limited IP address logs that go into Bitcoin mining. And so some people put in a lot of work. And when I say a lot, I mean thousands of man hours into like physically tracking down Satoshi's mining. Found out that he has mined about 1 million Bitcoin, but he's never spent them. He left them all in those 50 Bitcoin unspent mining rewards, which is very interesting. It sort of says something about Satoshi himself, or at least about what he's doing. He's technically, quite a wealthy man. $650 million is no joke, obviously, but he's never spent it, and he hasn't even moved it. So it's sort of the equivalent of getting paid a check every week at your job and never cashing them. He's never cashed any of his checks. No one's really sure if he's going to at some point in the future or what his purpose is. Some people have speculated that he intends to wait until 2140 when all the Bitcoin have been distributed and then start paying them out to miners himself, which is why he hasn't spent them anywhere. No one really knows. He didn't say anything. He's sort of a mysterious figure and has always been. So no one's sure exactly what he's up to with them, but I think most people would consider it a fair price to pay, as Bitcoin has really solved the unsolvable problem of how do two people trust each other without knowing each other. So the purpose of the network as a whole is to motivate a bunch of people to operate fairly and democratically. The transactions in that timestamp system anchor off of each other. So we know that when you have the third block that it confirms what the second block said and so on. And so the network over time builds consensuses of trust. So in order to make any change to this behavior, you have to have a democratic simple majority. So this is important because the size of the blockchain, that 1, 2, 3, does actually matter. So over time, as the chain gets extremely long, it becomes very hard to sort of restart. If you tried to rewrite the blockchain, you wouldn't really be able to. There's sort of no way for you to. As a result of this, there have been two very significant fork events. A fork event is, as I mentioned earlier, when two different blockchains sort of spin off from each other. The first was in August of 2010. A bug was exploited that granted 184 billion Bitcoin to two separate addresses. Obviously, this is ridiculous. There are only supposed to be 21 million. How can you get 184 billion? So people at first thought that this was sort of the end of Bitcoin, the experiment. No one knew how to deal with this. I mean, what do you do when suddenly someone has generated several hundred times the amount of currency that's supposed to exist? Well, you do it democratically. Users coordinated among themselves. They updated their clients. They fixed the issue. And they created a purposeful fork. So that blockchain that continued on that had the 184 billion got ignored by everyone. Everyone said, well, I don't think that's legitimate. So they created a fork. They went back in time and created a new timeline for Bitcoin, sort of. Any transactions on the old chain, the 184 billion one, just sort of vanished off into nowhere, and things were fixed. So this is what I meant when I said that transactions are mostly irreversible. Things like this are extraordinary events within the network that require the cooperation of the community as a whole and are not commonplace. In general, transactions just can't be reverted. The other primary fork was the March 2013 event. What essentially happened is that there is a transaction size limit on blocks of about 1 megabyte, and there was an issue where new clients had changed that limit, and so there was sort of a mismatch between the network. This block got broadcast that didn't meet those requirements, and so part of the network thought, oh, that's not legitimate, and the other one thought it was, and so we split again. This caused a fork, and it was resolved in pretty much the same way. The community reacted, people got together, fixed it. Not hard. Well, in a limited sense. So just a quick little side note. These are the denominations of Bitcoin. So a Satoshi is the smallest little one. People use MBTC to say 0.001 millibitcoin. The commonplace is now bits for the 100,000th, which is the 5 zeros. And one little calculation, which is that if there are 7 billion people in the world and everyone wants to own the same fraction of Bitcoin, everyone gets 3 millibitcoins, 0.003. That's sort of a reminder of how nascent this technology is. most people today talk about owning 1 Bitcoin. But in reality, 1 Bitcoin is a huge amount more than would be a fair, quote unquote, share of the network value. If this is something that's going to grow into a worldwide payment network, as many anticipate it will, then the numbers are going to get a lot smaller really quickly. People are going to be transacting in very, very small amounts. And so when we hear today talking about 1 Bitcoin at $500 or $600 or $700, people may look back and just think to themselves, wow, how silly. You know, now we think about transactions in 0.0001 or something like that. So I mentioned earlier blockchain.info. It's a website to view the blockchain. I strongly recommend checking it out if you want to take a look at any of the things I've said at various points in this, or just sort of to look around at what it looks like. It's complex at first glance, but surprisingly simple to go through. So how's Bitcoin going to change things? Everyone talks about it as a world-changing, disruptive technology, hurting banks and payment processors and so on. So it really will revolutionize money, and it's going to do that in a lot of different ways. First, it's a store of value that isn't subject to inflation, like gold. Unlike gold, it's also a unit of exchange. You can't really give gold bars to someone anymore. No one does that. It's silly, and past that, it's inconvenient. Bitcoin works like gold in not being subject to inflation, the 3% devaluation of a currency every year, but it doesn't work like gold in that you can send it to people over the internet. This is going to lead to micropayments becoming more common, crowdfunding, as in with this presentation or with charities for water in Africa and so on, have all become simpler for people. Privacy has also become easier to access within the pseudonymous system of Bitcoin. If you don't want people to know what you're spending money on, MasterCard and Visa no longer have to know. Bank of America does not need to know whether or not you are shopping online at Target or at Walmart. Doesn't matter to them anymore. You can use a system where no one knows what you are buying. And that is something that many people have been looking for that hasn't been there. In addition, it's also created a viable escrow system that doesn't involve a trusted third party. You can do this using something called multi-signature addresses. How this essentially works is that me and Mike are agreeing to escrow 1 Bitcoin between us. We create a multi-signature 2 of 3 address, which is just like that. Public-private key pair is a set of 3 public and private key pairs. And we put the 1 Bitcoin into a thing, and the rule for the 1 Bitcoin is that unless 2 of the 3 addresses on the signature to it agree to send the Bitcoin somewhere, it doesn't go anywhere. So if me and Mike agree that we should send the Bitcoin somewhere, then they'll go somewhere. If me and Mike don't agree, there's only 1 of each of us. We can't really do anything. In addition, we would involve a trusted third party, but we only need his help if me and Mike aren't happy with each other. So if I'm buying something from Mike and he ships it to me and it arrives broken, we contact the third party. If it arrives fine, I just send a message to Mike and I say, hey, everything's fine. I agreed to send the Bitcoin to you. And then Mike agrees, and we don't even ever have to involve the people we're working with. That's a very useful system. It's going to greatly reduce the burden on Bitcoin equivalents to credit card networks. Credit card networks function by allowing customers to dispute things through chargebacks. This is the same system, except that now there's no manual oversight needed. Because if me and Mike don't have any problems, we never need anyone else's help. We can just solve things ourselves. So in addition, Bitcoin is not under the control of any entity. And when I say entity, I'm referring to sort of the semi-singular, as in not government entities, not individual people, but it is subject to the network as a whole. A democracy of miners and users and so on. And lastly, it's very literally theft-proof if you secure it properly. There have been many issues of theft within the Bitcoin space. Mt. Gox is, of course, the big one everyone knows about. It got a lot of press coverage. But if things are done correctly, it is much, much more secure than keeping cash under your bed. It's much, much more secure than keeping cash in your debit account. Literally every time you swipe your debit card, you have the possibility of someone walking off with your information and being able to steal your funds. That cannot happen with Bitcoin if you do things properly. And that is really, in my view, the most important aspect of this, is that it has given control of funds back to the people who own them. So where is it going to be used? Pretty much everywhere you can use PayPal, and also plenty of other places. You don't have to worry about canceled transactions. PayPal has fallen into disrepute among plenty of online sellers because of the ease of scamming with it. If I buy someone from someone online with PayPal and they ship me a product that weighs the same amount and is about the same size but is completely different, it's very, very, very hard for me to do anything about it. On the same side, if I buy a product from someone on PayPal and I'm the scammer and they send me the correct thing and I issue a case, it's very hard for them to win if I do a good job of it. PayPal is sort of inherently subject to these problems because of the issue of a centralized system that wants to keep its customers happy. PayPal is not making money from the people selling things using it. It's making money from the people buying things with it. So that's the people they keep happy. Merchants are, by and large, pretty unhappy with PayPal. I know that myself as a merchant who used PayPal for a long time to run a business, and I have had so many horrible problems with PayPal that I mean, this presentation would be 5 hours long if I started talking about PayPal. So merchants hate PayPal because of the capricious chargebacks. Bitcoin has no chargebacks. It's another merchant advantage. In addition, credit cards like PayPal, large fees, chargebacks. And finally, those same fees. So someone is still paying in Bitcoin. They're paying a lot less than with credit cards, but it's now the sender, not the receiver. That's a big deal to merchants. It might not seem like it is, but instead of getting dinged for 2 to 3% every time you're taking in money, your customer's paying a little bit extra. Maybe you give them a little bit of a discount to compensate for it, and you're also not subject to the chargeback risk. In reality, you're saving as much as 5% of your gross margin, and that can be very, very, very significant. How are we going to use it? Have you guys seen QR codes around? Well, you've probably never had a reason to use them. Probably seen them and just sort of thought they were funny little technology. They're the easy way to use Bitcoin. Instead of entering in a big address, you scan it. It's very quick. I use QR codes all the time to pay people for stuff, and it's actually faster than a credit card. You just have to scan it and then hit OK. It's incredibly simple. You're going to use it for pretty much everything. We were talking about 6 confirmation transactions for exchanges. If you're doing something where you don't care about the security of funds, you can use something called 0 confirmation transactions. If you remember when Alice sent me a Bitcoin and it propagated into the blockchain quickly, that's like this. You can just wait for it to be accepted by the network as a valid transaction and then just go on your way. So you can actually use it for coffee. I know people like to say that that's the big problem with Bitcoin is you have to wait 30 minutes for stuff, but merchants aren't going to try and be chicanerous about coffee. You can just let it happen. If you get charged back for your $3.50 cup of coffee, you don't really care. And the odds of something going wrong with Bitcoin are much, much lower. Suppressed political groups, another place where this is going to be put to significant use. There's no bank account, so there's no one who can tell you that you can't accept money from people who want to donate to you. A large or a significant situation for this would be WikiLeaks, whose PayPal account was revoked. I don't have any stance on whether or not WikiLeaks is good or bad, but I do have a stance on whether or not they should be allowed to accept donations from people who want to donate to them. I don't think we should restrict the economic freedom of people to donate to people they want to, and this has created a way for that to happen. Sending money to relatives in Cuba, another form of economic censorship that Bitcoin can solve. At the moment, it's very hard to move money from the States to Cuba. Bitcoin changed that, although it may still be illegal based on where you are, of course. Buying things online. Bitcoin is a way to cut out exchange and wire fees. Another place where it's going to do something significant for merchants. So for a second, though, I want to step off and talk about not Bitcoin, but something else called Litecoin. Litecoin is an altcoin. So have you ever wanted to make your own currency? See your own face on it? Well, you can. Bitcoin's an open source project. I'm not going to say that anyone's going to use Fredbucks or whatever. But because you can just change things however you want, you can create parallel networks. You can make your own rules. So Litecoin is the most popular of the altcoins. It has a market capitalization of about 15th or 20th of Bitcoin. So it's relatively tiny relative to it. It uses a slightly different mechanism for hashing. Instead of SH-8256, it's something called script. And instead of every 10 minutes for a confirmation, it's every 2.5. So you can see it's very related to Bitcoin, but it's not quite the same. There are a number of other altcoins, and they can be very interesting. So each one comes with very different things, different modifications. They could have different number of coins, different distribution methods, different confirmation times, and in some cases, as short as about 10 seconds. So you can also have different methods of securing the network. Bitcoin's method, the mining process, is called proof of work to people involved with it. There are also things called proof of stake. Proof of stake lets people store coins and be paid interest on them, sort of like keeping them in a bank account. So if you're holding on to your coins, then you can use them to secure the network, process transactions in the same way as mining, while also earning interest on them. So there are quite a few coins like that that are very interesting to some people. Proof of transaction is a system like proof of work, where instead you're occasionally rewarded with coins for sending money to people. This is one to encourage people to be spending the coins. So some examples. Dogecoin. I don't know if you guys have heard of Dogecoin, but it's a humorous currency. It's got a picture of a silly-looking dog on it. And that caused a lot of people to dismiss it immediately. But it's actually been very significant. It raised $50,000 for charity water in Africa. It sponsored a NASCAR driver, a Jamaican bobsled team. It sponsored an Indian lugist to go to Sochi, who otherwise wouldn't have been able to go because he was too poor. He won the bronze medal, if I recall correctly. But it's derived from Litecoin. It's very similar. And it's got a huge, vibrant community going on the internet because people like silly pictures of dogs, apparently. And they're willing to use it as a form of currency. And that sounds so ridiculous at first to people until you go take a look at a chart and it says that all of the Dogecoins in existence are actually worth somewhere around $75 million. And it's just like, whoa, what? What's going on? So Dartcoin is another example of an altcoin. It uses something called X11 instead of SHA-256. And it actually is an anonymous system, unlike Bitcoin's pseudonymity. It does this through a complicated process similar to CoinJoin or Dark Wallet within Bitcoin. Mintcoin is an energy-efficient cryptocurrency that uses proof of stake to create new coins. It is energy efficient because it doesn't need Bitcoin miners running all the time. So it's sort of the green cryptocurrency in a way. Fluttercoin is a cryptocurrency whose blocks are discovered by spending coins, proof of transaction. Fluttercoin also uses proof of work like Bitcoin and proof of stake. It's actually merged all three of them. That's the icon for Dogecoin. It's a silly-looking dog. And it seems so ridiculous that this is the logo for a currency. We think of currencies as having eagles on them, not dogs. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's just an animal either way, right? So to continue, Namecoin is another altcoin currency, one of the earlier ones that came about. And it's relatively likely to replace ICANN as the method for registering domain names on the network. ICANN is a centralized system that allows people to register domains. You pay money to a bureaucracy that manages domains, and they do a fine job of it. Nothing wrong with them, but Namecoin can do the same thing, except it is a decentralized system that doesn't have to trust a set of bureaucrats to do the job for them. As a result, it's much cheaper, much more efficient, and invulnerable to subversion. Nextcoin is another one. It's a method of tagging real-world assets to coins. So you can tag deeds or stock certificates. Primecoin is one that uses as its proof-of-work method a system that discovers new prime numbers, which a number of mathematicians, including my brother, are quite interested in, actually. You can sort of imagine that we might also be able to take this a little farther. Maybe we could create one that folds proteins and helps find cures for cancer. Maybe we could create one that does gene sequencing and tries to create sequences for animals in addition to the human genome, and so on and so forth. So simply because Bitcoin runs on a proof-of-work system that doesn't do anything useful other than the ledger doesn't mean that every cryptocurrency has to. MadeSafe coin is a new development, but it's creating a decentralized World Wide Web. Just like the blockchain is decentralized among a number of computers, imagine if you could cryptographically hash all of the information on the World Wide Web and store it on a distributed network of computers. Well, now the internet is censorship resistant. Right now with ICANN, you could have a website taken down. This happens often, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is the big obvious one people talk about. If you can create a censorship-free web using the Bitcoin protocol to store things in various places, you can end that practice very, very simply. Another example of that same concept is something called storage.io, which is a substitute for Dropbox, the popular cloud storing method. Storage.io actually lets you rent out your own computer space to let people store things on your computer. You never have access to the information, they never have access to the rest of your computer, and everything is stored cryptographically hashed. But you can actually get paid in Bitcoin in exchange for using your extra hard drive space to store other people's files. It's doing the same thing as Dropbox, except decentralizing it and allowing anyone to participate instead of keeping it as a secure, single, centralized network. So Satoshi's real brilliance isn't its applications as a currency. It's the blockchain technology. It solved the unsolvable problem, trust between two nameless entities. I don't have to know who Mike is. Mike doesn't have to know who I am. He just has to know he got a Bitcoin from me. That's it. We can be done. What can that mean? A lot of things. It can mean the advent of decentralized autonomous corporations like Storage.io. Storage.io doesn't need anyone to run it. It can just be run on a mathematical protocol. No one has to be working there. No one has to do anything. and it runs. It's Dropbox without employees. Smart contracts, houses that literally know that your address owns them. You don't need to pull out the deed to your house when you want to prove to someone you own it. You can store it in the blockchain. Digitized assets, same thing as those smart contracts. You can make stock ownership transfer instantly. Instead of waiting 2 to 3 days for your stocks to clear when you sell them or buy them, you can do it instantly. You can send them with a cryptocurrency. You can use it for copyright and intellectual property protection. So how you do that is something called proof of existence. Imagine you write a book, like I wrote a book, and then you hash it using SHA-256. You can put that hash into the blockchain where it's recorded forever. And you just send it to yourself, and you sent yourself a tiny, insignificant amount of money. What do you have? A blank slide. You have a proof that you had exactly that book at exactly that point in time, that you had written it, and that it's your work, and that you were the first one to do it. And no one can ever really question it because it's in the blockchain, which is a decentralized ledger monitored by thousands of computers and thousands of people throughout the world. And it's sort of finally the end, you know. There's no one who can question whether or not you wrote that book. You can actually go back in time and prove it. And in the process of doing so, you don't have to tell people what was in the book you wrote. So you could also use this for secrets of various kinds. So that was everything I had to say. And I'm happy to answer questions if various people have questions.